Hello, welcome to the convention. I'm John James. I'm a professor of educational leadership at St. Louis University and the director of the Institute for Catholic Education. And I'm going to share with you a topic here, improvements in operational vitality of Catholic schools, a national perspective. First of all, I want you to know I'm not just a professor, but I'm also a Catholic school dad. Now, that having been said, this picture is about 10 years old. In fact, my kids would probably be thoroughly embarrassed to know that I'm sharing this with you nationally. But these are my 4 kids 10 years ago when they were attending Holy Redeemer in Webster Groves, Missouri. They're all now much more grown up from this. But I just thought I'd share that with you here to begin the presentation. So the information I'm going to share with you comes from primarily these sources of information. First and foremost from Tim Dwyer, who basically did a national study regarding the quality and scope of diocesan policies about 15 years ago, back in 2004. I've also accumulated a number of pieces of data from the annual statistical reports and the financial reports put out by NCEA over the last 15 years. More recently, myself and my doctoral student, Matt Keppel, replicated this study by Tim Dwyer just a couple of years ago, back in 2019. And I'm also going to be sourcing a new monograph that's coming out from NCEA to help practitioners in terms of benchmarking their own school and improving their school in the areas of operational vitality. So that's identified in red, which should be coming out very soon from NCEA to help you benchmark your school against national standards. It also includes all the data that I'm sharing with you here today, as well as additional data. So without further ado, I just wanted to share with you maybe a little bit about our context. And I'm sure this is probably a good time for you to think through about our context in terms of how has Catholic schools changed over the last 15 years, particularly in the areas of operational vitality. Has it gotten easier, harder? Have we gotten better in some areas? Have we gotten worse in some areas? So what I'd like to share with you is that basically this context from where I sit is that Catholic schools have moved well beyond the simple structures that they were a half century ago. We've moved into the realm of being professional bureaucracies. Within that, we've had to navigate some conflicting tensions that are inherent in operating a Catholic school within a complex market economy while providing a critical apostolic mission of the church in accordance with faithful stewardship and distributive justice. Basically doing the church's work in a market economy and also looking out for everybody. Quite a challenge. We also know that market forces have forced us to take a lot of different adaptive changes and get very creative about the way in which we do our work. And as a result of all this, a number of Catholic schools have closed and enrollment has dropped. This is no more evident than this last year as a result of COVID. So I'm going to begin here with maybe a quick snapshot of how superintendents saw Catholic schools 15 years ago and today. So again, this comes from Tim Dwyer's study from 2004, as well as the more recent one, 2019, done by myself and my graduate assistant, Matt Keppel. So here you can see, and this will be repeated in these slides, blue in 2004, red in 2019, so you can make comparisons. And clearly from this, you can see that from the superintendent's vantage point, there's a higher number, higher percentage, or actually higher number here that see that Catholic schools within their diocese are not financially viable. And we have certainly seen that here as a result of COVID. So a slight shift from 15 years ago in terms of diocesan perceptions regarding the viability of Catholic schools. So moving forward within this goal, and we can look back over the last 15 years and look through them through either more of an optimistic or a negative light. What I'm going to do with you here today is present the data and put forth a challenge about what you are going to do about this in your particular school, because that's ultimately what matters the most. So the goals for this presentation is to share with you some of the changes that have taken place in the last 15 years regarding policies, procedures, and expectations for Catholic school financial management, writ large operational vitality. As I share with you this information, you'll hopefully be able to benchmark your own school or diocese against best practices and also these national trends that I'm sharing with you. But most importantly of all, I hope that this spurs you to develop a seed of a plan to move your school forward regarding operational vitality, because ultimately that should be our goal from looking at all this data and getting this work done. So again, just to recapitulate those goals, drilling it down to yourself, what does this mean for me? As I share this data with you, what I'd like you to do is think about, how does this data compare to my school? How does this jive with my own experience? And then as you hear this information, I think there's going to be some information that maybe you can use to leverage people. Maybe it's your school board, maybe it's your parents, maybe it's your superintendent, or if you're a superintendent, maybe it's your principals, maybe it's your bishop. But at any rate, this data hopefully can be power to help you leverage people and to ultimately move your school forward. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that later on in the presentation and certainly at the very end. So in terms of some of the general findings regarding school operating budgets, nationally and across most regions, higher percentages of dioceses require the submission of an annual budget by a deadline that is earlier than before and is also increasingly approved as opposed to just receiving it and reviewing it. Also across the board, a higher percentage of dioceses require a standard budget format and a chart of accounts. Those are categories for income, expenses, personnel, materials, so forth and so on. So now I'm going to share with you some of the graphics that indicate that. So I'm going to stop right here and talk a little bit about how these graphics are going to be organized. And this will allow you basically to take them in a little bit easier and to see what's going on. So again, this graphic mirrors the one that's earlier. Blue will be 2004. 2019 will be in red. So you can see the progression from then and now. Also in all these graphs, the national numbers will be over here on the right-hand side. So you can always begin by looking at the right-hand side and to see, well, what's the national trends? And then in many of these graphs, it's either broken down by region, these are the NCEA regions, or by the size of the diocese, broken down by 5,000 enrollment increments. So the very largest archdiocese in the country, the proverbial top 12 in the 30,000 or above, are going to be over on the far right-hand side. And then the very small diocese in terms of school enrollment, those from 0 to 5,000 will be over on the far left. On this particular graph, you see the regions from New England all the way on over to the far west. The other piece in terms of understanding the graphics is what this N means. The N means the number of dioceses in each of these categories. And that might be helpful to understand the significance of maybe each one of these different segments, whether they be the regions or the number of dioceses within those population zones. So we begin with this one. Elementary schools required to submit their annual budgets to the superintendent diocese. We can see that there's a slight increase in that requirement. And in this particular one, I break it down by regions. You can find out for you within your region, is that true for you and your school? And how does that compare within the context of this particular region? The other piece that I shared is whether these budgets are reviewed or improved. So over the last 15 years, you can see here, now this is one variation to this graph, blue is reviewed, red is approved. You can see on the left-hand side, 2004, only about 10% of the diocese actually approved the budgets. That has risen to a 22.3% nowadays in terms of the approval of budgets. So clearly there's a stricter scrutiny being played to the budgets that are submitted by the respective schools. Another graph indicates the date by which budgets must be completed. So if we take a look at 2004, which would be the blue graphs, you can see this nice, beautiful mean distribution here, kind of a nice bell-shaped distribution with some submissions happening as late as August and September for the start of a school year, or even October. Clearly, there's been a change since 2004 to 2019, where those dates are shifted much, much earlier. Notice the preponderance of the red graphics here on the left-hand side, which is February through June, and very low numbers in those months of July, August, and September. So clearly we have a bimodal structure. Dioceses tend to be requiring those budgets in March and June, and certainly the date has shifted much, much earlier for the submission and or review of those budgets. Another piece is whether schools are required to utilize a standard budget format comparing 2004 and 2019. Clearly, there's an increase across the board in all the various different regions as well as across the nation. We can also take a look at this from the size of the diocese. So this is the first graph that I'm showing you in terms of breaking down the size of the diocese. On the right-hand side, you can see the national numbers, 123 dioceses, clearly an increase in the percentage of dioceses requiring a standard budget format. And you can see within your range, your school, which diocesan range it falls into and how that sits. In all these cases, there's an increase in the number of dioceses that require a standard budget format. This is broken down here by region in terms of the standard chart of accounts. So again, you can see the national numbers, an increase there, and it's broken down by the regions. Here we have the chart of accounts broken down by the number of students in the diocese. So the national numbers there on the right, you can find your school within that numerical zone and see how your school fits in. But this is an encouraging sign. It clearly shows a movement of dioceses towards generally accepted accounting principles and having a standard format. What this does is allows dioceses to accumulate the data on all schools much, much more effectively, to keep maybe closer tabs on how schools are doing, both positively and negatively, and also provide principals, pastors, and everyone else in the diocese some benchmarking data about how a particular school is doing in regard to other schools from an operational vitality or financial standpoint. So now I'm going to move in terms of the general school revenues, some general findings in the last 15 years between 2004 and 2019. Nationally, we see an increase in the percentage of dioceses requiring or suggesting a funding mix for elementary school revenues. So in other words, a recommendation that this percentage comes from tuition, this percentage comes from parishes, this percentage comes from other sources. Nationally, and consistent with findings from those annual reports, we see that revenue from parishes has unfortunately dropped, while the revenue from other sources has increased. We also see nationally an increase in the percentage of dioceses having policies or guidelines regarding financial support for non-school parishes that have parishioners attending a neighboring school. This is important. We need to cut down on the competitive nature and basically the disincentivizing of attending Catholic schools. We want to make sure that when kids come to our school, that there is parish support from regardless where the family comes from. Nationally, we see a slight increase in the percentage of dioceses that have policies, guidelines regarding the level of subsidy a sponsoring parish is to pay. And in terms of its support to a Catholic school, this range between the minimum and maximum has tightened a little bit. So I'm going to be sharing that graph with you a little bit. We've also seen an enormous increase in the percentage of dioceses across all sizes that have policies or guidelines regarding the amount a sponsoring parish's ordinary income that can be directed to a Catholic school. So again, this is a limitation placed on parishes in terms of maybe the minimum or the maximum that they might be directing towards their Catholic school. We've noticed that this range, both minimum and maximum, have shifted downward. So we see, in a sense, kind of a trend of the church putting limits on parishes for the purpose of protecting the parish's financial well-being with regards to the Catholic schools. We also see a significant increase in the percentage of dioceses across all sizes and most regions requiring financial support for Catholic schools from all parishes, regardless of whether they have a Catholic school or not. This is a very good sign. This is a very good thing. This is the church's movement towards a stance of distributed justice. This whole idea that Catholic education should be the business of everybody, and whether your parish has a Catholic school or not, we all ought to be contributing towards Catholic education. So I'll be sharing those numbers with you. We certainly would like them to be higher than what they are, but I will show you there is an increase between 2004 and 2019. So let's jump into it. The diocese require or suggest a funding mix for the elementary school revenues for 2004 and 2019. Generally, we see an increase in the percentage of dioceses doing this, which is primarily driven by the smaller dioceses. So in this sense, the smaller dioceses that maybe allowed parishes and parish schools to just kind of do what they want, they've wised up to the fact that maybe we need to give some suggestion to these pastors and these small parish schools. This breaks that same information down by region. So again, the national numbers will remain the same. You can see where your school falls in terms of these regions. So again, nationally, we see an increase driven primarily by the Plains, the Southeast, and the Far West. Notice from the N, okay, the West and Far West, which is basically Texas all the way and inclusive of California, is a huge number of dioceses, 33 out of the 122 in this particular sample. So that's really driving that national increase, the Plains, the Southeast, and the West, Far West. We do see exceptions. So New England, Mideast, and the Great Lakes, they've seen a decrease in the suggested funding mix for Catholic school revenues between 2004 and 2019. Now this one is a little interesting because the question was asked of superintendents is, if there is a recommended or required mix, what percentage of the school revenue is recommended? Key point there on recommended. So this is not in the requirement range from each of the following sources. So again, this is limited to those who said they do have those policies. So that limits the number. You can see this in the lower left-hand corner from the national numbers. We went from 122 down to basically 66. But now you get a sense of what that recommendation is, both from 2004 to 2019. Within the parentheses is the 2004 numbers. Outside of the parentheses is the 2019. So then I've also indicated in red and green what that change is. So for instance, if we go down to the national numbers, we see that the change between 2004, 62.4% coming from tuition and fees, to 2019, 61.9% recommended coming from tuition and fees, is a recommendation basically the same, a drop of a half a percentage point. We do see that the recommendation for support from the parish decreased 4.9%, and from other sources, 4.7%. And of course, you can find where your school falls within this range, whether it be a Plains, a Mideast, a New England, or what have you. Then if we take a look at it in terms of the size of the diocese, again, the national numbers will not change, but the region numbers will. And you can find your school within this range and find out within that region what is the recommendation, if they do have policies in terms of school revenue going towards the school, what are those recommendations from those sources? So there again, you can see tuition and fees somewhere around that 61, 62%, parish subsidy support around, moving from 26.6% in 2004 to about a 21.7% in 2019. So hold on to that number in your head, that 21.7, approximately 22% recommendation from parish support in 2019. Underline recommended. And also remember, this is only 66 dioceses, somewhere around half of them. So we're gonna come to that in a second. The reason why I wanted you to hold on to that number is this comes from the annual statistical reports from the NCEA, both the financial and the annual statistical reports. And what I've done here is plotted basically what the mean revenue as a percentage of the operating budget is coming from tuition and fees and from the parish. And this graphically, longitudinally, shows what percentages on a national level that parishes have contributed. So remember that number recommended was like 26 or something like that back in 2004. And then the recommended is around 22% nowadays. And then we check reality. Reality shows that the support from parishes dropped off dramatically between 2005 and 2007. Think the Great Recession. And as a result of that, the revenue coming from parishes as a percentage of the school's operating budget has really not recovered. Now, there might be a lot of things involved there. One might be the school operation is growing at a much faster rate than what the parish is. So it might be that the parish is still contributing more and more money, but it's a smaller or flatter percentage of the school's income, if that makes sense. Another thing that might be driving this is obviously the financial impact that we've seen since 2007. We have the Great Recession. Then certainly we've had other problems here, including COVID to the most recent, that we have not recovered from that. So I think this is an important graph. And again, most importantly is, how does this compare to your school? Are you getting the 10 to 12% if you're an elementary school from your parish? What is your diocesan norms for that? Because clearly we can see at the national level, the recommendation is for that 22% range. So again, that's some information for you to ponder and to consider. Now, if we take a look at secondary schools, it's a much flatter graphic. You still see a slight gradual increase there in terms of the mean revenue as a percentage of operating budget coming from tuition and fees. But notice this gradual increase in the amount of fundraising and advancement that secondary schools have tapped into. So that's an intriguing piece that we might come back to a little bit later here. The fact that over the last 15 years, secondary schools have not only raised more money, but increased the percentage of that money going toward their operating budget. So I think that's an important factoid to hold on to and to consider as we move on forward. So now as we move forward in terms of looking at policies or guidelines regarding the financial support from non-school parishes that have parishioners attending a neighboring school. So a parish has kids going to a neighboring school and a Catholic school. Do they actually have policies to send money over there? The good news here is that we do see an increase between 2004 and 2019. There is an exception there in New England. You might have noticed that New England has a lot of exceptions to these. This obviously might be due in large part to the changeover in ordinaries, obviously, and the changing in conditions. So that's for people in New England to consider and to ponder. So this is broken down by the NCEA regions, and then we can take a look at it by diocesan size. So again, the national numbers do not change, but you can see within those various different regions how this broke down. Now in this situation, across the board, the regions or the size of the diocese, the numbers have stayed the same or increased, which is a good sign in this regard from a Catholic school perspective. So now we're going to move on to policies and guidelines regarding the level of subsidy a sponsoring parish is to pay to support its Catholic school. So here again, we see a slight increase nationally. Again, individual regions might vary. Again, New England seems to be a little bit of an outlier here. And we see that's relatively good news. So this is important for us in Catholic schools. Then if we take a look at it by size of the diocese, the national numbers don't change. You can place yourself within these different regions, size of the diocese to figure out where your school fits within this context. And again, this is the level of subsidy a sponsoring parish is to support its Catholic schools. Having a policy. As I alluded to earlier, the level of subsidy a sponsoring parish is to pay to support its Catholic school 24 and 2019. If yes, we followed up and asked, what are those minimum maximum levels expressed as a percentage of total revenues? So you can see in this graphic back in 2004, there was a pretty wide variation between the minimum and maximum levels that a sponsoring parish is to pay to support its Catholic schools. In the last 15 years, you can see that that's tightened quite a bit, right? The minimum has moved up to 15.2%, and the maximum has moved down from 20 to 31.7%. I do have the standard deviation in there, so that indicates that there still is a great deal of variability in terms of those minimum and maximums that dioceses have, right? But in general, at the national level, that range has been tightened. The takeaway from this, you could say, is it demonstrates absolutely parishes have a responsibility to their Catholic schools, but maybe a growing consensus around what that amount ought to be in support of the Catholic schools, not venturing too far outside of those minimums and maximums. So then if we take a look at the policies or guidelines regarding the amount of a sponsoring parish's ordinary income that can be directed to its school. So this is more of a limitation in terms of potentially the maximum amount that a parish can be giving to the Catholic school. And here you can see at the national level, a huge increase, as well as pretty significant increases across the board. And again, this is more diocesan policies limiting the amount of money can be directed to go to the Catholic school. These are the numbers broken down by the size of the diocese. Again, you can find yourself within the size of the diocese. And this is these are the numbers broken down by the NCEA regions. The national numbers don't change. You can see the regional numbers changing. So again, throughout those regions, with a couple of exceptions in New England and the Mideast. Then if we take a look at what those numbers are, so if they said yes to that in terms of policies or guidelines regarding the amount of sponsoring parishes' ordinary income that can be directed, we followed up by saying, okay, so what are they? The minimum and maximum levels as expressed as a percentage of total revenue. Here we can see that the range has shifted downward. That's why I say these policies are particularly designed to protect parishes in terms of their operational vitality vis-a-vis the school. So the minimum dropping to 9.5% and the maximum dropping to 28.7%. Then I think we move on to this next question, which is really kind of exciting for us as Catholic schools. Does your diocese require financial support for Catholic schools from all parishes, regardless of whether they have a school or not? This gets at that whole question of distributive justice. Is Catholic school the work of the church in which we all should be participating in it? Or is it just a parish by parish thing that we should allow to rise and fall with the financial capacity of the individual parish, school, and parish? Clearly, there's an increase towards a recognition of this distributive justice. It's slight, but it is an increase from 14.4% to 28.7% across the country. And you can see how it's broken down by the various different diocesan sizes. And then if we take a look at it in terms of regions, again, the national numbers don't change, but you can see some increases here in the various different regions. And again, this is a nod to distributive justice, basically getting at financial support of Catholic schools from all parishes, regardless of whether they have a school or not, from a policy standpoint. Okay, I'm going to share with you a couple of graphics that may indicate some drivers that I really encourage you to take a look at within your own school. One of them is the student to teacher ratio, which has changed dramatically over the last 15 years. So by taking the NCEA annual data and lining it up in a longitudinal fashion, you can see here that between 2006 and up to 2019, the student to teacher ratio for elementary schools has dropped from 16 to 1 to 12 to 1. So that's a lot of personnel. That means we've got fewer students in front of each teacher, which in a sense makes the educational proposition a lot more expensive. Now, the operative question for you in your school is, do we have the right amount of people? Or do we have a misalignment between the number of students and teachers? So is this number reflective in your school? Is there a misalignment between the number of teachers and pupils, and that's kind of artificially increasing our cost and putting a drag on the school? Or do we have the right number of people? So again, that's an important question. Compared to secondary schools, that ratio dropped from 13 students to one faculty member to 11 students to one faculty member. So basically a drop of 2 people. Now, again, it's difficult to make many like clear declarations at the national level. Is this because the market demanded it, right? We need more people to do more things in the schools. Or is this a signifier of maybe some lack of efficiencies that we could clean up? Again, it's national data. It's for you to ponder and to think about within your own circumstance. So now I'm going to drill down into the longitudinal data about Catholic elementary per pupil cost and the mean tuition. So if we take a look back in 2006, the amount of tuition collected, so this graphic breaks down the pupil cost and the mean tuition. So the cost is the higher one, the tuition is the lower one. So back in 2006, $2,604 was the average tuition. and it amounted to 61.0% of the average per pupil cost of the cost to educate a student of $4,268. So those are the 2006 numbers. If we jump forward to 2019, we see that basically the cost and the tuition has increased. $4,902 was 75.3% of the average per pupil cost to educate a child of $6,513. So basically, tuition was covering 61% of the cost in 2004. It jumped up to 75.3% of the cost to educate students more recently in 2019. This, again, is indicating a burden shifting over to parents in the form of tuition. This is at the elementary level. Let's take a look at what happened at the secondary level. So the average tuition charged for secondary schools in 2006, $5,870 was 81.5% of the average per pupil cost of $7,200. If we jump forward to 2019, the average tuition, $10,864, was 73.3% of the average per pupil cost of $14,825. Take a look at the numbers. That's a shifting of burden away from parents. Tuition is covering a smaller percentage of the cost to educate students in secondary schools. Now, you might be thinking, how could that be? What's going on here? I think the answer comes here in terms of that advancement number that we talked about. Income generated from fundraising advancement increased from 7.3% in 1988 to 13.9% in 2018. Secondary schools have done a much, much better job of gearing up their advancement efforts and not only raised more money, but raised the percentage of that money in terms of covering the overall cost to educate students in the schools. So I'm going to conclude here with a question and then maybe some things to consider as you put together your plan for your own school. So the first question is basically a question for you. Who am I called to be? Am I called to be a Messiah? And if you're called to be a Messiah, then your model is Atlas. You should just take all the burdens of the world, throw it on your shoulder, declare woe is me, and keep moving forward. So obviously, we are not called to be a Messiah. We've had one Messiah, and he died on the cross. You can see right above me, 2,000 years ago. So clearly, we are not called to be a Messiah. If that's your model of leadership, it's idolatry. You need to let go of it. Basically, what we are called to be is priest, prophet, and king. We are called to be those three by our baptism. We have a sacramental commitment to become priests, prophets, and kings. So a prophet is one gifted with more than ordinary spiritual and moral insight, or an effective or leading spokesman for a cause, doctrine, or group. The model of a prophet is that little blue guy down in the lower right-hand corner that's encouraging others to wisely see a fulcrum and a level and achieve the same purpose, moving the world. Okay, so my question for you is, reflecting on your sacramental experience of baptism, priest, prophet, and king, are you trying to be a Messiah in your school, or are you working towards being a prophet? Because ultimately our faith says you should be a prophet, not a Messiah, and to do otherwise is idolatry. Okay, so what does that mean? It looks like I jumped forward a couple of slides. Let me go back here. Apologize for this. Kind of an odd advice coming from a professor. I encourage you to play stupid and let others do the work. Now, there is sound scriptural evidence behind this. On the road to Emmaus, after Jesus rode, scripture clearly tells us that the apostles were walking away from Jerusalem, and Jesus joined them. And what did he say? He said, so what are you guys talking about? And the apostles were aghast. They said, are you the only person in Jerusalem who doesn't know what happened? And they started telling him everything that had happened. Do you think Jesus didn't know what was happening to him in Jerusalem over the last 3 days? So he just listened to them. He explained the scriptures, and then they recognized him in the breaking of the bread. So we have a scriptural evidence of Jesus playing stupid in order to engage others in the work that they should be doing. So what does this look like? If you're a principal, I would encourage you to say to a board member something like this. Say, I'm curious. Oh, by the way, the board members should be like that accounting type or engineering type, the people who love data, that know Excel spreadsheets, they like messing with numbers. The type that are afraid of kindergartners, but know their way around the block in terms of Excel spreadsheets. That's the person you want to tap, okay? So go to them and say, could you put together some longitudinal trends about our costs, our tuition structures, revenue? I think that might be interesting just to look at for our school for a longitudinal standpoint. Once you do that, you'll have them hooked. They will become data junkies. More importantly, all those concerns that you used to have just privately, now you've got another person who's going to be very concerned about this. Because once they do the work and putting it into an Excel spreadsheet, once they see the trends, then they own that data. And when they own that data, they have a responsibility to do something about it, okay? Now, another thing that you can do, and let me just say this clearly, I get no money from this book. This book is an NCEA publication. I'm happy that NCEA is getting the revenue for this. But I do have a book coming out, Operational Vitality, a source book for practitioners that have all this data and more in this book to help you benchmark your school against these national trends. So flip one of those books to your board members, right? And say, how do we compare nationally, regionally, the whole bit? This will supercharge them. And I think it might spur some conversations amongst your board about what does this all mean. In fact, the book helps them, guides them through that process of considering what it all means. I think the next thing you need to do is talk faithful stewardship. That's a basis of our faith and is basically the implicit assumption behind the funding models that we ought to be having for Catholic schools. This begins with educating parents about the costs and tuition. Now, here's the good news. If you do step one and you militarize your board, you get that engineer accounting type person who puts that all into the Excel spreadsheet, right? Then they're going to be the ones that are going to want to educate the parents. And quite frankly, they are the ones who should be educating the other parents. It shouldn't be you up there talking about the financial situation for the school. This should be a parent-to-parent conversation, board member to parent conversation. And you can get there if they put the data together and if they come to that conclusion. I think we also need to talk Psalm 116, verse 12. What return can I make to the Lord for all that he has given me? I think everybody needs to begin with gratitude, particularly the board members, parents, parishioners. Look at all the wonderful things that we have in our parish. And I need to look at myself and see how blessed I am. And recognizing that all these gifts come from God, what return can I make to the Lord for all that he has given me? That prepares them for this understanding of distributive justice. A parents in partnership, an annual support type program. If you're interested in that, I did it in my own parish back when I was a dad, back when I was chairman of the school board. We put into a situation annual giving thing that raised a minimum of $50,000 for every year, and it's been going on for over 10 years. So I guess I'm responsible for raising more than $500,000 for my parish. Never thought about that. So anyway, we got the parents in partnership. Also, NCA will partner with you. You might have heard about their day of giving. They'll do all the back order website stuff to help you put a day of giving within this context of the parents in partnership. I think we also need to practice distributive justice. What I mean by this is that graphic that I showed you, financial support for Catholic schools from all parishes, regardless of whether they have a school or not. It increased from 2004, 14.4% to 28.7%. 28.7% is not enough. We need to make certain that all Catholics recognize that we all should be supporting Catholic schools, whether our parish has a Catholic school or not. Which brings me to the last point, and that is demand justice. We're very blessed in the fact that the United States Supreme Court ruled positively in Espinoza versus Montana Department of Revenue. It opens up the door for student tuition organization scholarships. This is different from vouchers. In fact, much better than vouchers. If you're interested in that, I have an article from America Magazine. You can click on this, copy it, take a look at it about the significance of it as well as the Blaine amendments. I think ultimately long-term, we need to have every school board member on every school board, a whip, a legislative whip. What do I mean by that? A person on your board who is connected in with your state Catholic conference and the superintendent's office. So when there's some sort of bill that's going on in the state legislature, that can be communicated on through the line to the parent, the whip on your board, who can then fire off an email to all the other parents within the school. You know, it's one thing to hear about some nebulous bill that might be in some committee at the legislature. That's easy to blow off, right? But when you get an email from a fellow parent that says, you know what, parental rights are at stake here. We need to get the legislature to support Catholic schools. Contact your legislature right now about bill, blah, 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 blah. And if it comes from a fellow parent that I know, that I pick up my kids at the parking lot, raises it to a high another level. So there I've got a recent blog that NCA asked me to do regarding this most recent situation in terms of the school enrollment, as well as this concept of legislative action. So now I just like to close with this whole idea that if you have any questions or concerns, feel free to contact me. I have my email address there. Happy to help you on out. And thanks for listening.